So that year, we're talking about the first half of 1972 now, 1917, was obviously very important for me. I mean, I learned that I was quite young, and I learned that, you know, I could survive on my own, and I became very disillusioned with various forms of political Zionism. This is just before the Yom Kippur War. And opener in all sorts of ways. One of the most interesting things I did was I did a lot of archaeological work. There was a major dig going on under the southwest wall of the old city. So a very archaeologically and historically, but of course always also politically significant place, right? The boundary between the Temple Mound and the old city. It falls away very steeply into Gehenna, right, into hell. It's the site of Herod's palace, perhaps, or King David's, perhaps. The level that the archaeologists were at when I was working there was Byzantine, and there were many yards still to go. And that, I think, the meticulousness of a classical archaeological dig is an extraordinarily interesting object lesson in every sense of that word. I found a coin, and I found a tiny piece of turquoise glass, which apparently was important because it was a Byzantine perfume bottle design, and this showed this was the bathhouse, right? So you learn a lot. Patience, which I still haven't learned, attention, reading the signs, the method of Zadig, as Huxley calls it in a famous article in the 1860s, right? That only by attention to exquisite detail can you make any inferences at all, and those inferences, I much later learned, have the quality of abduction. That's to say, they're inferences to the best explanation. There are 100 reasons why a small piece of Byzantine turquoise glass could have been in this place. But the archivist said, yes, we know what that is. So the loveliest explanation is also always, as Peter Lipton would say, likely to be the right one. So detection, right, all that was going on. I learnt a lot. And it was exhausting. It was unbelievably exhausting. I came back to England in the summer of '76, went youth hosteling, and then came up to Trinity with an open exhibition to read natural sciences. And the rest is history. Trinity was an amazing experience as an undergraduate. It was still a single-sex college between 1972 and 1975. It was enormously supportive. It was pretty stern, certainly in terms of provision. It was fantastically stern. There was no central heating, for example. We are still in the period of toasting waffles in front of the gas fire.
Or Nabokov period.
Exactly. And the cellars flooding regularly, right? And the shared rooms and so on. And in effect, although again, of course, I didn't realize it at the time, a very classic, rather 19th century pattern of training for the tripos. So the vast bulk of significant teaching took place within the college, right, with the other students reading natural sciences in Trinity. Right? This was definitely a collegiate rather than a university experience, right? In ways that I think have changed. So even though, I mean, I could bore for England about this, even though the early 20th century master of Trinity, J.J. Thomson, had been terrified, he says in his autobiography, about the effects of the big science labs on college life, because, as he put it, laboratory workers would lunch at college, and they would lunch in the lab. They wouldn't be seen around college, the authority of the colleges would be undermined by these centrally funded, wealthy, centrally organised, big workplaces. And to a certain extent, that's the history of the university in the 20th century.
That's happening now with the West side.
And I think that it's, I mean, Subspecie Eternitatis is one of the most dramatic changes in the university. It's the sort of thing Cornford gestures at in Microcosmographia. But it's at least as interesting sociologically as it is fiscally. I mean, Cornford is a genius because he's got his eye on the cash apart from anything else. The Adulamites who live in caves along Downing Street are the masters of the big new science buildings, and they have the money, says he. Well, that, I think, is an interesting issue, but the way in which a large and powerful and, as it were, cocooning institution like Trinity, as it was 30-odd years ago, nevertheless preserved very strong college modes of teaching and so on, is very striking to me as I think back. So all the mathematics and physics and so on, that was basically college teaching. And it wasn't until my really towards the end of my second year, which is the spring of 1974, that my kind of centre of gravity academically begins to switch from college to department. And the department to which it switches is definitely history and philosophy of science. At this stage, again, I was an oik and didn't know any of this. The department was not in the Whipple building on Free School Lane because that was undergoing massive reconstruction. It was in a series of buildings on Lensfield Road, Bennett House. And these tiny seminar rooms became rather inspirational for me, and I wonder why. Partly because of the kind of teaching, I mean, of the then teachers in the department, the man I would single out, and my generation would always single out, is the late Gerd Buchdahl. Not because his work is the work that I followed, that's not at all true, but because of the way he taught, and because of his egalitarian humility, which I'd never encountered in Cambridge from anybody else. So let me talk about Gerd for a bit, because he's really a maître à penser. Gerd was Jewish and Central European intellectual of the classic type, who'd been in Australia, having been a refugee during the Second World War, and was interned in Victoria as an enemy alien, where, as a young man, he started a reading group in philosophy and philosophy of science in the prison camp in rural Victoria. And after that, got a post at Melbourne University, and more or less single-handedly, I'm going very quickly over a fascinating but marginal for this point story, more or less single-handedly established the first real department in history and philosophy of science. There was one in London in the 1920s at UCL, but this one in Melbourne was serious. And it involved complex political negotiations with the science faculty, with the philosophers. It brought together historians and philosophers of science in a principled way, pedagogically as well as in research. And the Melbourne department became, under his aegis, very, very important indeed. His central area of interest was critical philosophy of Kant, above all. Much later on, he was to publish a stunning monograph called Metaphysics and the Philosophy of Science, which was the content of the seminars and lectures that he gave us in the early 70s. He came to Cambridge in the 50s, more or less, I mean, this is not entirely accurate, with the express function of setting up a program in Cambridge like the one that he'd already established in Melbourne. So the Cambridge department, qua department, is very much the child of the Melbourne department and the project of Georg Buchdahl, who became its first head. It was he who hired Mary Hesse, brilliant young mathematics academic from London, and together they really forged the department as it is now. By the time I met him, he was already a grand, stately, hilarious man, with an enormous sense of humour and very expansive views, who, and I think this is not untypical for influential teachers, almost completely failed to communicate the content of what he was teaching, but absolutely succeeded in communicating its importance. So that for the first time, really, in my university career, I was sitting with someone for whom this was a matter of life and death, if not more important than that. And he really did do things that are now the subject of glorious reminiscence and anecdote, like he really did turn up at the second lecture of term in Michaelmas and say, everything I told you last week is wrong, and I want you to throw away those notes, and we'll start again. And this was on John Locke's epistemology. And while it was very difficult indeed for an ill-informed Cambridge second-year natural scientist, otherwise working in physics, to understand why this was such a puzzle, right? Does Locke believe in innate ideas? Is Locke really committed to the view that everything we know is due to sense data that we receive from outside our minds? Or is there not some prior set of categories within the mind that organize and dispose and combine those sense data? I couldn't initially see why you'd lose sleep about that question, but I absolutely saw that Georg was losing sleep about this question, and no one else had communicated to me the idea that a question like that, or indeed any question, might be so significant to one's, as it were, moral salvation. So I thought, this is for me. I mean, I'm not going to do this, but something like this is for me. The other thing that Georg and his colleagues were very, very good at, very good. Martin Rudwick was also teaching on the programme, which was a treat and privilege. Amazing lecture course on 19th century earth sciences. Was to imagine that even if you had no background, your views were worth hearing. So that's partly what I mean by the egalitarianism, that this was a set of problems which one ought to be able to describe such that everybody in the room could take part in the conversation on roughly equal terms, right? Even, and in a way, interestingly, particularly where matters of fact were concerned, right? I mean, that seems amazing to me in retrospect. So I learnt a lot slightly indirectly, right? In the summer of 74, and this I think is probably the single most important thing that happened to me in this period, I noticed that the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich offered internships, which were essentially for volunteers for 2 months to work in Greenwich on some aspect of the collection, and you were paid enough to allow you to rent a room somewhere near the museum. So I did that for the summer of 74. And that was the big deal for me, because that was the first time that I'd really worked with and behind the scenes at a museum first, that I'd actually got the experience of thinking about scientific hardware and scientific instruments, because one of the jobs I was given, now I don't think they do this, but it was an absolutely wonderful job. The entire instrument collection of the National Maritime Museum, one of the great collections in the world after all, was held on index cards, was catalogued on index cards. So I was given a Polaroid camera and about 24 sextants, and I had to take these to bits with white gloves and take a Polaroid of each bit and paste the Polaroid onto a card and write down what it was, and then take the next bit, and then take the next bit, and then put it back together again, and then go on to the next instrument. So it's presumably somewhere in the basement of the basement of the basement of the National Maritime Museum there are these rather inadequately annotated, rather fading, presumably, Polaroids of this hardware. So, as one can imagine, I mean, that was absolutely revelatory for me, that you could learn things from this hardware, that minute differences between putatively identical devices mattered. And I was working with a small group of curators and assistants who were world experts. Commander Waters, splendidly named head of the navigation department, and Alan Stimson, brilliant historian of scientific instruments. And I found material both in the collection and in the library which suggested a possible dissertation topic for my final year. By then I was utterly committed to doing History and Philosophy of Science for Part 2, which one can do in the Natural Sciences Tripos. That was a bit of an agonising decision, actually, because I really wanted to stay with physics. The timing is interesting, perhaps, from the historical point of view, because mine's the last year that studied physics in the old Cavendish. Because 75 is when the physicists moved from town to West Cambridge to their glamorous new buildings. So it was also, of course, the centenary of the establishment of the Cavendish. And Crowther's, I think, rather inadequate book had just come out, The History of the Lab, over that century. What that did to me was make me think about the history of physics, right? So you could tell I was a lost soul already, right? So I was more excited and entertained by, as it were, the archaeology of what was left on Free School Lane, especially since it was next to where the HPS department was, than I was by, what might happen with the move to West Cambridge. But it was still a bit agonising, and very often one is strongly dissuaded by directors of studies and others from switching into something like that, because one was giving up the possibility of research in science, basically. That was made very clear to me, and that was a very bad thing. Nevertheless, I did that, and it was, I think, the right decision, and I had an absolutely splendid time in my final year. I had a lovely room in Neville's Court. I learnt the wonders of the university library, or began to. The dissertation topic that I'd found in Greenwich proved to be viable and interesting. And at this point, I think this is also not unimportant, my father, who by then was a professor at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, was on secondment to the Shannon Free Airport Development Corporation as an advisor. This really dates it. This is the period just before and during accession to the EU. So the Shannon Free Airport Development Corporation hired my father as an advisor on ways of improving economic development in the west of Ireland, particularly in County Clare. And this involved my father and mother moving for a very long period to an absolutely wonderful cottage in a village called Corofin in Clare, about 15 miles from Shannon, between the plains of the Shannon Valley and the Burren, the high desert limestone plateau, where the Cromwellians said there was no water to drown a man or no tree to hang him from. This had been Daniel O'Connell's base in the 1820s and 30s, so it was the Liberator. It was De Valera's constituency in the early 20th century. It was an eye-opener in a different sort of way. Again, archaeology played a role, but also politics. This was the early 70s in the west of Ireland. We were not very far from where Whitelaw and others were meeting with the IRA in various pubs in East Clare. There was the local bar, Beaufy Quinn's, which was run by a man who built a submarine, which he sailed, if that's the right word, in the Loch. everything from the reminiscences of an Irish resident magistrate all the way to the most intense contemporary politics was co-present there. So that in the vacation I would go from Cambridge to the west of Ireland and sit in this cottage writing about the problem of longitude or whatever. And that was really an amazing set of experiences to think about. Our landlord there was a man called Ignatius Cleary, who was a local saint. There's no other way of putting it. Very important man for me to think about what intellectual life is. I mean, this was a man who was the unmarried middle son of a very large family, the youngest son of the Cleary clan, also unmarried. Enda was the housekeeper. This was classic. Beautiful Georgian house called Riverview. Naishi worked extremely hard to reclaim the disused Church of Ireland, Protestant church in the village, and turn it into a museum of the history of Corofin. So again, I think museology and material culture played a role. We helped, because he was our landlord. I wrote labels. Right? And all of that came together, I think, to convince me that this was the sort of life that I quite liked. As usual, I couldn't quite make up my mind in the first half of 75 what I really wanted to do. I mean, if I reminisce, the reason why I applied to read natural sciences at Cambridge, one reason, apart from its enormous distinction and privilege of studying there, was that you didn't have to make up your mind. Right? I think I wouldn't have applied to Cambridge if, like Oxford, there had been a specialist physics school, right? Because I couldn't decide between physics and chemistry or physics and maths or whatever. And similarly, in the final 2 terms of my undergraduate life in Cambridge, I couldn't decide at all what I wanted to do, so I applied for everything. I applied to go into the Foreign Office, for example. So I took the civil service entrance exam.
Did you get in?
Yes, I did. The most amusing aspect of that, there were many amusing aspects of that, the most amusing aspect of that was being vetted. So, sitting at home in Brighton and having a retired policeman from Hove actually come to interview both me and my parents. And I got through, I think, security vetting. One point that they were very clear on, and this is, after all, right in the middle of the first oil price shock, because this is now the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, and the miners' strike, and so on, in the 3-day week. By 75, Labour had come to power again, and there was, as there regularly is in Whitehall, a general feeling that there were insufficiently many people with science degrees working in the civil service. This is a sort of periodic feeling. So the fact that a Cambridge natural scientist was applying to go into the Foreign Office was thought to be a good thing. There was some discussion, in retrospect very interestingly, right, about the possibility of me entering on the stream that goes into the FCO, where you also commit yourself to studying what they called rather wonderfully at that stage a hard language, by which they meant Arabic or Chinese. And I was very clear that if I'd gone in Foreign Office, I would of course have taken Chinese and gone off on a completely different route, presumably to Hong Kong. But in the end I was offered a Kennedy Scholarship to go to Harvard for a year, so I did that. Because Harvard had and has the world-class history of science program.
When you say the world-class, you mean the best?
Yes. And it was going through a period of enormous transition in the mid-70s, but it taught a thorough, systematic master's program, which Cambridge did not. And many eminent scholars were working there. And that was what, I think, trained me in and committed me to this particular discipline, and certainly convinced me that what I wanted to work on was early modern natural philosophy, Newtonianism and so on. Bernard Cohen was the one of the eminent scholars at Harvard, and the way that graduate program was organised was exceptionally good, because it balanced together intense seminar teaching, which I enjoy, having been taught that way by Gerd Buchdahl, with what are called directed reading courses. So basically one sat with, in my case, Franklin Ford, one of the best historians of early modern and Enlightenment thought, who just provided one with a bibliography. You read it. You wrote an essay. He read the essay. I mean, that seems an ideal way of teaching. I reflected on staying. I could have stayed, I think. They would probably have given me a scholarship. But I, by this time, was committed to saying things about Isaac Newton, and it seemed silly to say things about Isaac Newton there when I could say them in Cambridge. So I came back to Cambridge in 1976.
Did you enjoy it in America?
Of course. I mean, I was 19 years old and 20 years old, right? And
so you've gone to university very young.
yes, I mean, I've been here. I've been in Cambridge. I came up to Trinity when I was 17, and I think the year in the States was really a year of maturing. It was also a year of much travel. I mean, I did what folk were supposed to do, are supposed to do, which is to drive around everywhere, and I had the unique privilege of not being able to drive, so I could actually see things and read maps. There was New Orleans for Mardi Gras, there was the drive across the country over the summer to San Francisco. It was bicentennial year. Gerald Ford was president. It was a country in absolute crisis, after all, in the wake of Watergate and Vietnam. I was, as I think a lot of young Brits often are, impressed and excited by hybridity and pluralism and robust optimism on the one hand, and depressed by introversion and what one thought of as a deeply ill-informed attitude to the rest of the world, and a certain kind of strange provincialism. These were the prejudices of youth, but they're very common, right? And the continent-sized scope and scale of what was involved. It wasn't the first time I'd been to the States. I'd been to the States when my father was on sabbatical at Cornell back in 1967, which was an almost, if not more, dramatic and crisis-ridden period. This was exactly the moment of the demonstrations against the war at the Pentagon, right, that Norman Mailer writes about. And Cornell, Ithaca, was a centre of anti-war sentiment. I'd been to the local junior high school in Ithaca called DeWitt Junior High, which is now, I think, a women's centre in downtown Ithaca. And I was taught about how well the Green Berets were doing in Vietnam. They showed John Wayne's film. I was taught what to do if there was a nuclear attack. I'd never seen an air raid shelter for nuclear war before. I wrote an essay on General Burgoyne and the Battle of Saratoga from the British point of view, just to piss them off a bit. And we stayed in an absolutely wonderful Marcel Breuer tower block up on the hill on campus. That was a rather limited but interesting view of the States, and then it sort of massively broadened when I was at Harvard. I think educationally, the most important thing about the Harvard program was the course offered by Everett Mendelsohn. So he's an interesting, and for me, very important figure as well. Deeply active politically on the left, on the liberal left. A major peace campaigner. Teaching a course in the sociology of science, a phrase I'd never heard in Cambridge. I mean, here in 1976 it would have been treated as oxymoronic. And the course, again, one realizes in retrospect, was a brilliant summary of the state of, what shall we say, social and social scientific thinking about the natural sciences just before a major sea change, methodologically and disciplinarily, was about to happen. So that, for example, this was a course oriented partly around the classics of sociology, Talker Parsons, Merton, particularly Robert Merton, Ben David, by which I mean a sociology which took the problem of the sciences as explaining sociologically the asocial quality of the science. The function of this sociology from that point of view was to explain the fantastically successful prophylaxis that surrounds science. How could this communal, disinterested, skeptical, virtuous and progressive project have survived the enormous social pressures which might otherwise have corrupted it? One looked at how robust and well fortified the institutions of the life of science were. That was half the course. But the other half of the course was about alternative ideologies and alternative ways in the sciences. So one read Schumacher, amazing, and Thomas Saz. And that seemed like a kind of slightly schizophrenic picture. But the particular thing that I learned from and admired Everett more than anything for was, again, he was prepared to encourage any of his students to do whatever they wanted and to resource that as far as he possibly could. So this was a moment of very interesting micro and macro controversies around the sciences taking place in and around Cambridge, Massachusetts. On the one hand, a really important crisis and struggle, which Everett had personally been involved in, which was involving really major scientists like David Baltimore, Nobel Prize winner at MIT, on whether Cambridge, Massachusetts was prepared to host research on recombinant DNA. And there had been a conference at Asilomar which had proposed a moratorium on that kind of biomedical research because of its unknown and unquantifiable dangers. And the mayor of Cambridge, Mass, had played a really crucial role in insisting that labs in his city, which means Harvard and MIT, not do a certain kind of work. So all sorts of issues, very troubling ones, but really fascinating ones, about the politics of public science were in play. And Everett, as a practitioner and a participant, was able to tell us not only what was going on, but how one might study it, which I thought very interesting as theme. And then the science news was full of, again, what is now seen as an example of pathological science, a phenomenon called polywater, which is now almost completely forgotten, perhaps. So what was polywater? Polywater, it turned out pretty soon, was literally 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. If you hang horizontally very, very thin glass capillary tubes over very purified distilled water in vacuum flasks and then rapidly reduce the pressure, basically evacuate, the water evaporates and then condenses preferentially inside these thin glass capillary tubes. And significantly, scientists in the Soviet Union, really very eminent physical chemist called Boris Derzhagin, announced in the international scientific literature that this stuff that was condensing inside these tubes was still water, but it had very spooky properties. It stayed essentially solid or viscose to very high temperatures, and it had various other interesting thermal properties, which, if checked out, would have been economically fantastically significant for insulation, for example. I mean, a water that doesn't melt would have saved the planet in certain ways. It also had a good shelf life because at roughly the same time, the greatest of American science fiction writers, Kurt Vonnegut, had published a novel called Cat's Cradle, which describes a substance called Ice-9, which strangely has rather similar properties to polywater, so it was easy for the New York Times to know how to describe this stuff. And because it was a Soviet discovery, the Office of Naval Research and other American government agencies were quite prepared to subsidize research into this stuff. And after about 3 or 4 years, it died completely. And I was able to learn how to do oral history. Not as well as you, but I was able to learn how to go up and down the east coast of the US with a small notebook, talking to the veterans of this episode in Princeton, at MIT, and at Maryland, and elsewhere, because I was coming just after the end of the debate. And that taught me a lot. I mean, talking to scientists who, as they cheerfully admitted, had been wrong temporarily was absolutely fascinating. And I learned that what counts as wrong is achieved during the course of quite complicated and extended processes of fantastically impressive, ingenious, collaborative work. And I wanted, as it were, an account of the sciences that did justice to that experience. I wrote this up as a term paper and sent it off to this new journal called Science Studies, which was edited from Edinburgh by a very saintly former BBC radio producer called David Edge, lovely man, who I knew of because he'd written a marvellous book on the history of radio astronomy about Ryle's work with his colleague Michael Mulcahy. So I sent it off to this journal, and they promptly rejected it, quite rightly. But the referee of the journal, whom I later discovered was a man called Harry Collins, then based in Bath University, wrote, and massive respect, this was really a life-changing experience, pages and pages of comments on how one could better have talked about this episode. And I learned a lot from this rejection. So there I was back in Cambridge with one rejected article at the age of 21, back in Trinity, who'd been generous enough to give me a graduate scholarship as well. Again, havering between this kind of work, which seemed to me to be really exciting, and working on Isaac Newton. And my supervisor, Michael Hoskin, convinced me, rightly I'm sure, to work on Newton. He pointed me towards a remarkable PhD, not exactly PhD thesis, TypeScript 3-volume object in the university library by a deeply eccentric, I didn't know how eccentric he was at that stage, Spanish Jewish nobleman called David Castillejo.
How do you spell that?
Castillejo. So, David, whom I never really met, David had been the first scholar to look in any detail whatsoever at Newton's theological papers. Newton's theological papers, the plurality of them anyway, had come up for auction in 1936 at Sotheby's and had been dispersed over the world. A large section came into the hands of an Iraqi Jewish scholar, intellectual banker called Abraham Yehuda, a friend of Einstein, and in fact a pretty fierce anti-Zionist in an interesting way, who'd, in complicated ways, partly through Einstein, partly not, left them to the Jewish National Library in Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And David Castillejo, we're talking now the late 60s, early 70s, had really been the first scholar to look at these documents, and they are astonishing. Their existence was not at all unknown. Their contents, in a certain sense, not at all unknown. Though there's a very complicated and lengthy story, which it would be tedious to go into, about how folk had explained their existence, or explained them away, or ignored them.
Don't censor yourself, Simon.
Well,
it's all fascinating.
David Brewster, the greatest of Newton's biographers, by far, I think, from the 1830s to the 1850s, worked on various versions of Newton's life, and he had access to essentially all of Newton's papers. And Brewster...
They were in Cambridge then?
No, they were in the hands of the family of the Earls of Portsmouth, a cadet branch of the Newton family, because Newton himself, of course, had no children. He had a niece, rather gorgeous niece, called Catherine Barton. Voltaire falsely alleged that Newton became head of the Royal Mint because of the beauties of his niece. This is in fact false, but never mind. And through her and various other family connections, John Conduit and somebody came into the Earls of Portsmouth's hands, and in the 19th century they had all the papers at Lymington, I think. And the bulk of those manuscripts are not mathematical or natural philosophical or astronomical. The bulk of those manuscripts are alchemical and theological. And Brewster, fierce Scottish evangelical, for whom the ideal type of the man of science was, of course, Isaac Newton, and who had the category martyr of science in which to fit men like Galileo and Newton, both ignored and explained away this material, right? Ignored in one sense in that he didn't take it very seriously, explained it away in that he tended, as did many commentators at the time, to see this as senilia. This was the maunderings of old age, or something, or Newton had been poisoned, or whatever. But Brewster, because he was also a man of virtue and honesty, transcribed some of the material. And so it was in the public domain. I mean, we aren't talking about the sudden revelation of Newton's occult, prophetic and theological interests. That is not the story. That's a story that makes potboilers lots of money. So every 10 years or so, someone writes a book saying, guess what? Newton did alchemy. We didn't know that. Or, guess what? Newton wrote thousands of words on the apocalypse and the second coming of our Lord. We didn't know that. We did. But how did one approach that? So, in the 1890s, the whole of the Portsmouth collection was offered to the University of Cambridge. And the great and brilliant Joseph Larmor, in particular, the Lucasian professor, was given the job of reading his predecessor's papers. And he did what any good Edwardian scholar would do. He sorted them out into true and false. And this produced, on the one hand, the Portsmouth collection in the University Library, which is the mathematics and natural philosophy, broadly speaking, and the rest was given back to the family. And death duties then kick in the 1930s, so they auctioned the rest at Sotheby's in 1936. Maynard Keynes, of course, bought, thank goodness, a very substantial and deeply significant group of papers which live in King's. And subsequently writes an absolutely magnificent, slightly crazy, but absolutely magnificent lecture on Newton as the last of the magicians. And as I say, a very substantial group of these papers goes through various dealers to Abraham Yehuda, to Alexandria, to Jerusalem, and there it is. David Castillejo in the 1960s is really the first adequately equipped scholar to deal with this. Others had published bits. Herbert McLaughlin, a ferocious and rather incompetent Unitarian, had published extracts from the theological manuscripts, not very adequately. Others had begun to discuss this. I suppose the most important of them was the brilliant intellectual historian Frank Manuel, who'd given 2 sets of lectures in the States and Oxford, one on the religion of Isaac Newton, and the other on Isaac Newton, historian, that's to say on Newton's incredibly important work on chronology. But the Castillejo trilogy was just an eye-opener, because it was written by someone who was obviously disturbed in many different ways, and fanciful in many different ways, but who transcribed and tried to make sense of a very large amount of theological and prophetic work. And this seemed like a good area for a short PhD, which I then tried, not entirely successfully, it has to be said, to write between 1976 and 1979. And it's called, it has a terrible title, very bad pun, Newton's Cosmology and the Steady State, which was a pun as between the dynamics of his cosmology and his politico-theological views. And I tried to say some things about these papers and about what I took to be the relation between Newtonian cosmology, Newton's cosmological projects from the 1670s to the early 1700s, and his views about providence. While I was doing that, I was also doing lots of other smaller bits and pieces of research. And as usual, I was being a butterfly. I was kind of working on 3 or 4 different things at once. Michael had founded a journal, Michael Hoskin had founded a journal called the Journal of the History of Astronomy in 1970, which I think really helped define a new subdiscipline in the history of astronomy, where one could begin to write the history of this discipline, for example, from a more properly historical point of view. And the key historian of science in Cambridge, for me at that period, was Tom Whiteside, who'd published in the very first volume of Journal of the History of Astronomy on Newton's path to the Principia, magnificent and indispensable piece of work, and was at this point editing Newton's mathematical papers, one of the great triumphs of late 20th century scholarship. I was not equipped to really learn as much as I should have done from Tom, and he was maybe not the easiest person to get along with, but he was a sort of towering pillar of scholarship. In 1977, there was a major conference at Churchill College to mark the anniversary of Newton's death, 1727. And Tom was presented with the Sarton Medal, the most eminent medal in our field, and I was ridiculously asked to give one of the papers there, so I gave some kind of presumably jejune version of what was going to be in my thesis. But that was absolutely amazing, right, to be at anything like the top table. I got very interested in these issues of cosmology and cosmological development at the period. I found or transcribed a couple of papers written by Edmund Halley that I'd found in the library of the Royal Society. I published those in Notes and Records of the Royal Society because they seemed to bear quite directly on the issue of the danger of seeming atheist if one said the world was eternal. And Halley had notoriously failed to get the post of Savilian professor in Oxford in the early 1690s, even though one thought he was backed by his patron, Isaac Newton. And the story was that he'd failed to get this job because he was an eternalist, because he was an atheist, right? And these 2 documents from the Royal Society showed Halley trying desperately to show that he wasn't, so that seemed interesting. with Michael's very strong encouragement, I was able to begin publishing a series of pieces in his journal on or related to similar themes. At the same time, the manuscripts of, I guess, one of the greatest astronomers, William Herschel, were available in Churchill College in the library where Michael was working, and I was able to use those to work on William Herschel's astronomical and cosmological beliefs, and Michael very kindly published two of those papers actually in the journal, one on the discovery of Uranus. So I was doing a whole slew of different things. The single most important person whom I met in my field in the late 1970s was Roy Porter, about whom everyone has now said a great deal, because very tragically he died in 2001 at a ridiculously early age, 55, a few months after retiring. And I've written obituaries for him.
It would be nice to hear.
Yeah. So Roy, well, there's institutional and personal aspects there. I mean, institutional ones, first of all. Roy was the only member of the Cambridge history faculty remotely interested in what the historians of science were doing in the 1970s at all. There was no other conversation going on, as far as I remember. And he was a professionally trained historian from Christ's, where his own influences.
Another Jack Plum.
Exactly, Jack Plum, Quentin Skinner, Barry Supple, Neil McKendrick, John Brewer, and so on had either been his colleagues or immediate superiors. He'd been very close to Martin Rudwick. His PhD thesis, Roy's, was on 18th century Earth history, which he, of course, immediately published as a book called The Making of Geology. He showed us, by example and by precept, how you could be an historian, of the sciences. That's to say, what were the interests and skills that historians, properly speaking, could bring to the study of the past of the sciences. That was not obvious at that time. Almost nobody in the History and Philosophy of Science department in Cambridge had been trained as an historian. And there's a huge irony about the development of the discipline, which my former colleague Anna Meyer has written about beautifully, which is as follows. The history of science, as anything like an academic enterprise, really begins in Cambridge in the 30s through the work of Joseph Needham, Ernest Rutherford, Arthur Eddington, and others, Walter Pargle, and others. In other words, scientists who started a Cambridge Committee for the History of the Sciences, gave lectures on the past of their sciences, and especially in Needham's case and Pargle's case, argued ferociously for the indispensable role that a knowledge of and study of the past of the sciences must bring to the sciences. To summarise this very superficially and very brutally, after the war, one was therefore in this rather ironic situation, this is before Buchdahl arrives, in which members of the Communist Party, or fellow travellers, or both, dominated discourse on the past of the sciences in Britain.
Bernal, you didn't mention.
Above all, Bernal. Well, he'd left Cambridge for London just at the time of the committee starting, but of course his work in the 40s and early 50s, culminating in the vast book, Science in History, the vast tetralogy, to which all of these others contributed in different ways, and the launching of Joseph's project in the late 40s on science and civilization in China. I mean, that meant that, as it were, as it seemed, authoritative conversation, discourse, lecturing, publicity, knowledge of the past of the sciences was in the hands of historical materialists, who were scientists. And it seems clear that figures like Herbert Butterfield and Rupert Hall and others responded to that from within the discipline of history, and in fact from within the history faculty, in the most predictable way. The part of the sciences is too important to be left to the scientists, especially if they are materialists, and historical materialists at that. And there are a whole series of, for us, famous controversies and disputes, which of course had been launched in 1931 at the International Congress on the History of Science, held in London, where the Soviet physicist and historian Boris Hessen had given a lecture called The Social and Economic Roots of Newton's Principia, which was lèse-majesté. It was an attempt at an historical materialist account of Newton. And it had apparently a profound influence on Needham, on Bernal, Haldane, Hobben, Levy, and others. So there's an irony, almost a chiasmus there, right? Hard now to recapture, in which, again, this is ridiculously superficial, left-wing scientists were writing materialist history of the sciences, and conservative, in several senses, idealist historians were writing intellectual history of scientific knowledge. Butterfield's Origins of Modern Science, which is lectures he gave in Cambridge, comes out in 1947, is a kind of shining example of the latter, precisely to define the scientific revolution as, and I quote, putting on a new thinking cap, unquote, to give it nothing but intellectual origins, is a riposte to the Bernal, Needham, Zilsel argument. Okay, so jump forward to the 1970s. By this stage, idealism and intellectualism are firmly ensconced within the Cambridge programme in history of science and philosophy of science. And Roy Porter brought reasonably judicious social history back into the picture for all of this. Also, there's this kind of exemplary qualities. This was a very different way of life, put it that way, more literally as well as figuratively unbuttoned. And that seemed entertaining and seductive. Roy was generous enough to get me to give a couple of talks to his final year special paper that he taught on 18th century sciences, and got me to review quite a bit of stuff for the journal he was then editing, History of Science. And that really taught me an enormous amount about how to write and what to do, insofar as I've ever learned. And the third thing that happened, along with the Newtonian stuff and Michael Hoskin's influence and Roy's work, was going to France. In 1979-80, just as I was finishing my thesis, I was encouraged by my parents to spend quite a bit of time in Paris. And I was given a, what was it called, Thank Offering to Britain Fund Award, which I think must be the Norwegian government, administered through the British Academy, which paid for me to spend 2 or 3 months in Paris at a place called the Centre Cradle, which was a section of the École des Hautes Études.
It's Koyre as in the sun.
Yeah.
K-O-Y.
K-O-Y-R-E acute.
Yeah.
The Centre Cradle was then, and still is, the centre of certain kind of French study of history of science. It then lived in an unbelievably romantic set of rooms in the Rue Colbert, next to the old Bibliothèque Nationale. Low ceilings, winding staircase, uneven polished mahogany floor. The seminar room was also the principal study, and it was mainly occupied by 2 elderly, beautiful gentlemen. One, Father Costabel, who was the editor of the Correspondence of Mersenne, the greatest of 17th century knowledge brokers. The other, René Taton, the doyen of historians of Enlightenment science, and the editor of the General History of Science, and a good friend of Michael Hoskin in the General History of Astronomy. And they were very hospitable and welcomed me. and encouraged me to basically wander Paris archives, which was an eye-opener again. Looking at French astronomers who collaborated with or responded to Herschel and to British astronomers, and improving to a certain extent my French. At the same time, of course, this was Paris, this was 1979-80, so I was able to go to the Collège de France every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. and go to lectures by Foucault, which was the seventh of his lecture courses at the Collège de France. This was on the practice of confession, pretty unforgettable experience. Foucault's lectures were divided between public lectures, which he clearly deliberately scheduled at 9 a.m. in order slightly to control the crowd. We're 4 years after the appearance of Surveiller et Punir, and he was working on the project that is the history of sexuality. The lecture audience consisted of a small layer of grandes dames in furs from the Ile Saint-Louis who would walk across the river every morning with their little dogs, leave the dogs outside and listen to the great man. A largish group, mainly of East Asian students by this stage, because Foucault's status in China and Japan was beginning to be massive, who'd all brought things I'd never seen before, which were these little portable tape recorders. And then right at the back, these ridiculously badly dressed and slightly smelly people like me scribbling notes for all they were worth. And of course that had a huge effect.
What were the lectures? What was he like as a lecturer?
He was quiet, high-pitched, charismatic, very rapid, allusive. He spoke off the text. Right, there would be 4 or 5 pages of notes, and the breadth of learning was remarkable. I mean, this was a series of lectures each week on the theology and philosophy of the practice of confession in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, the practices of truth. And one could immediately see how it developed out of discipline and punish. One couldn't see where it was going,